Hey guys, Navanad on No Limit Hold'em for the third and final installment of Navanad's No Limit Hold'em Poker Quiz version 2.0 Answers 3 of 3. So here we go. I wanted to revisit 23. That's the question we left off with in the last video. And anybody who's watching this that has not watched the other videos, it might be a good idea to go ahead and do that. If you want to take a poker quiz, it's there. We've got the answers here. It might be interesting. You might enjoy it, but don't feel like you have to in order to get anything out of this video. I think these videos have so far been making pretty reasonable standalone strategy videos. So if you haven't gotten your 30 minutes of video study time in today, this will probably be okay. So 23 was, which of the following statements is true regarding polar versus bluff catcher scenarios in No Limit Hold'em? A, the player with the polarized range will rarely bet the turn himself, regardless of position. B, the player with the bluff catcher range will rarely lead into the polarized range and rarely bet when checked to. Or C, the bluff catcher range has an inherent advantage in EV built into it that arises as a feature of games that feature wagers with incomplete information. C is not the answer, just based on the typos and clunky grossness of the sentence. But no, honestly, the answer to this question is B. The player with the bluff catcher range just has no incentive to lead that bluff catcher into a polarized range that is comprised of just entirely nutted value hands and bluffs or air. No, because we don't want to bet into a very strong hand when we've got a mediocre hand, and we don't really want to bet into the bluff either, because the only way we have of making money with our bluff catcher is to check and pick off a bluff, right? So B is I think pretty intuitive, or ought to at least make sense once you think about it. But there's one little feature of this scenario that people don't often talk about, and I think might be a little bit more difficult of an intuitive leap. And that leap is that when one player has a pure bluff catcher range, and the other player has a purely polarized range, and that means that all of player A's hands, the bluff catchers, are going to beat all of the polarized ranges bluffs and lose to all of the polarized ranges value bets. Once we understand that, we should also understand that position does not matter in this hand. So once ranges becomes significantly polarized and the other range becomes significantly capped and bounds, position becomes irrelevant. That probably seems like a bold statement, but let's think this out a little bit. Let's just go to the river. We can always start from the river and work our way back. Think about a river spot where you're playing a polarized range, where you've got a 2-to-1 mix, 2 nutted value hands for every 1 bluff, and you have a pot-sized bet left, so you're offering your opponent 2-to-1 pot odds, and he's already capped his range, but his range is also bound. He's like called flop and turn. This is a scenario where we are going to bet exactly the same number of hands as the polarized range, whether we are in position or out of position. If we're in position, we're going to lead with this range. If we're out of position, once we're checked to, we're going to bet this exact range. And the bluff catcher never bets whether he's checked to and he's in position, or if he's out of position, he's not going to lead. This is the answer, B, right? The player is not going to lead into the polarized range. He's not going to bet when he's checked to. So really you could probably change B to will never bet when checked to. It's definitely true on the river if one range is sufficiently polarized. So yeah, if you're in a spot where the P versus BC scenario is running out, in position, out of position, irrelevant. The player with the bluff catcher range will never bet if checked to, and he'll never lead into the polarized range. and the player with the polarized range is always going to lead the same hands, the same percentages, the same pot size, or the same bet size rather, if he's out of position or once he's checked to and he's in position. So I thought that was interesting enough that it might be worth revisiting. It's a situation in no limit hold'em that comes up fairly often. Yeah, it depends, but it's a situation where position is a completely irrelevant factor. Moving on. I like this question. I think this is one of the questions on the quiz that needed to be put out there. When 5 players limp into a pot in a full ring game with 100 big blind effective stacks, the button can profitably call with any 2 cards because of the 6.5 to 1 pot odds, as long as he can be pretty sure the blinds are not going to raise. True or false? And this is absolutely false. People think that, or a lot of people think, I hear even pretty good, knowledgeable, even respected players imply things like this. That, even a better example might have been if you are the big blind in a live cash game and there's a straddle and the action folds over, or you get your 4 additional limpers and then the small blind folds, and you're getting just 6.5 to 1, and you've got the last action pre-flop. Can you call with any 2 cards? And I'm not asking if you can call with a random hand, although that's probably also a no. But might be a little bit closer to true from the button. And I digress. That's not what we're asking. What we're asking is if you had a 7 and a 2 of different suits, could you call, or some like equally abysmal hand, can you call being that you're getting such good pot odds because of all the limpers? And you have to understand before you can really know why the answer to that question is no. You have to think about where are the pot odds coming from. Well, they're coming from the additional players that you have to beat with your 2 cards, right? So if you only had one opponent and you were getting 6.5 to 1 pot odds on the button, 100 big blinds effective, yeah, I'd say you can call with any 2 cards, for sure. But you're not against one player. The reason you're getting these stellar pot odds is because all the opponents, and if there's that many players in the pot, it obviously is going to cut into, all things equal, it's going to divide your chances of winning by the number of players, right? You're going to over-realize from the button and under-realize from the big blind, but you get the point. If you're not convinced, and I would think that that's pretty intuitive once you actually think about it, but if you're not convinced, let's do this. Get 4 or 5 friends together and sit around the table and deal out hands, starting hands to one another. Everybody put $2 in, and then flip your cards over and just run the flop, turn, and river to showdown. And since it is profitable for every single player, you'll all make money in the long run, right? Or if it's dependent on the button, then you can just take turns being the button. But really, if it's the button, well, I guess if it's the button and the big blind, then those 2 players, and we can alternate being those players, and everybody can go on a vacation to Las Vegas to put this new skill into action at the tables. I mean, obviously, if all of us limp into the pot, and we all have like different hands, different positions, if we all limp into the pot, we're all getting the same pot odds, but we can't all be in a profitable situation. Poker is a zero-sum game. Anything one player is winning, another player is losing. So it's not possible to, you do see this, you see it in game. You see one player limps in, another player calls, the third player overcalls. The next thing you know, the entire table limps in because that second limp, maybe the third limp, set off this chain limp where everybody's thinking, well, I'm getting better, every player is getting better pot odds than the player before him, but nobody really bothered to stop and think what that means to their chances of winning the pot. And there's also other things like implied odds. but there are reverse implied odds, and some of your 2 cards that you could have are going to have worse reverse implied odds and not such great implied odds than others. And definitely, you cannot just flick your $2 in without looking at your hand at a 1-2 game just because enough players have limped. That's crazy. Don't do that. Now, there are hands that aren't playable without getting good pot odds in a multi-way pot that get more valuable as additional players are limping in. Maybe you would have folded a hand like 4-3 suited if the action folded to you in the cutoff seat, but because every player limped in and now you have a chance at winning a really big pot with a hand that has some kind of streety, fleshy stuff going on, yeah, then that might turn a hand like 4-3 suited into a profitable call with enough players in and good enough implied odds. But remember, there should be a term for this, and I'm going to probably think of a term and coin it for your pot odds divided by the total number of players contesting the pot. That should be something. That should be a thing. That is the, let's call that Navin odds. Like Navin odds. Navin odds. Navin odds is the pot odds you're getting divided by the number of opponents. That's your Navin odds. Sweet. I like it. I'm having fun. Are we having fun? Cool. Alright, 25. A range cannot be both polarized and balanced by definition. False. You absolutely can polarize a range and still balance it. The 2 terms are not related. Polarized just means all nutted and bad hands. Balanced means that you've got enough bluffs to make, enough bluffs to make your value hands. How would we put that? Balance is the act of making your opponent indifferent, maybe? I digress. Anyway, 26. A game theory optimal strategy will incorporate loss leaders, and those are slightly negative EV plays meant to benefit the overall strategy at all reasonably high stack depths. So what this question is asking is, if we have at least a certain number of chips in play, or I guess at least a certain effective stack, does that mean that at that level, a game theory optimal strategy would include playing some hands or making some bets, calls, raises, whatever, that in a vacuum lose money, a little bit of money, but actually increase the value of the strategy overall. An example, you might think of using 7-6 suited to open raise under the gun might be a losing play in a vacuum, but it gives you better board coverage. It allows you to rep hands on, like if you're only raising 8s plus, ace queen, and ace king from under the gun, then once you open raise and the flop comes out like 5, 6, 7, or 7, 8, 9, or 8, 9, 10, 8, 9, 10, or 10, yeah, you get the idea. Then you can like never win the pot, right? If your opponent knows that you don't have any of that stuff in your range and that your range is capped at pocket aces, they're going to be able to take you off of the pot. They're going to be able to move you off of even the top of your range because you don't have good enough board coverage. Whereas if you start splashing some hands like 7-6 suited, ace 5 suited into your range, maybe jack 10 into your range from under the gun, now when the flop does come like 7-6 for rainbow or 8-7-6 two-tone, now you can make a bluff because or even semi-bluff because you'll have some hands in your range that you want to value bet the flop. And when you actually show up with a big hand, like you have 7-6 suited and your opponents don't expect you to because you have been opening a tight range from under the gun, then if your opponent attempts to move you off the best hand, well, now you're going to actually have a hand that he's going to run into it some of the time, which is going to allow you to bluff with your air on boards you otherwise wouldn't be able to. It's going to also allow you to value bet some boards normally wouldn't be able to. And it's going to help you to get value on boards that crush your normal range, because, or rather, no, it's going to allow you to I guess you could kind of look at it as getting value. Your opponents will have to call you more often if they suspect, like if they know that you're opening 7-6 suited, then they're going to have to pay you off some of the time when you make a continuation bet on ace, queen, 8 rainbow, right? So yeah, I mean, it does get you value when you do hit a big hand with your normal other parts of your range. Yeah, that's right. And it gives you some hands to bluff with on a variety of boards. But actually the answer to this question is false. GTO strategies do not incorporate loss leaders. One of the kind of fundamental features of a game theory optimal solution is that it's playing the max EV, or the Nash equilibrium. It's maximizing its EV against like another perfect GTO opponent at every decision point of every hand. So it actually is not the case that the GTO strategy would incorporate loss leaders. Not true. False. Should you incorporate loss leaders into your game? I would say probably not. If you don't even have to do it for balance and board coverage against the game theory optimal robot, I doubt you have to do it against Frank, the 68-year-old with the unlit cigar. 27. If you know for sure that a player is bluffing the river at frequency, if you know for sure that a player is bluffing rivers at a frequency that is 15% higher than equilibrium on the river, you should call with approximately 15% more of your bluff catchers. That sounds like a reasonable idea, right? Your opponent is bluffing a little bit more, so you should bluff catch a little bit more. Well, how much more? He's bluffing about 15% more often, so I'll just call him 15% more often. This is just flawed logic all the way across the board. It is true that if a player is bluffing some specific spot 15% more often than he ought to at equilibrium, then you should call more often. That part is correct. That's where common sense kind of breaks down, though. It turns out that if your opponent is bluffing the river at any frequency at all that is higher than equilibrium, then you should literally call with all of your bluff catchers. If your opponent bluffs 2% more often than equilibrium on the river, then you should call with 100% of your bluff catchers. That sounds crazy, right? Well, think of it like this. First of all, let's define a bluff catcher. It is going to be a hand that will lose to villain's value bets, but beat all of his bluffs. Now, what do we mean when we say that this player is bluffing 15% higher than equilibrium? That means that if he were playing at equilibrium, the number of hands that he would be betting and the number of bluffs in his range would be just the right amount to make you break even on your bluff catching attempts. So he would be trying to profit with his value bets and break even on his bluffs. The correct response would be to call with bluff catchers 50% of the time. So maybe take like the best half of your bluff catchers and call with those. If you know for sure that that player is bluffing 15% higher, then now every single one of your bluff catchers is profitable. Remember, the equilibrium is that exact ratio that makes you break even on your bluff catchers. If he's out of equilibrium, if he's out of balance, and he's bluffing too often by any percent, that means that by definition, he's not making you indifferent between calling or folding your bluff catchers. You're not indifferent, meaning you're not breaking even, meaning that you're making money on all of your bluff catchers. So if you're making money with all of your bluff catchers, what percent of your bluff catchers should you call with? Right? Okay, so there you go. That's a falsie. False. And number 28. Which of the following is not a true statement? A, if you could play a perfect Nash equilibrium in a heads-up game, your profit would come from the degree to which your opponent failed to mirror your perfect strategy. B, flat calling ace-ace pre-flop is a way to uncap your calling range. C, larger bets allow you to work more bluffs into a polar range. D, the advantage to having the initiative going to the flop is roughly equal to or on par with a positional edge. Okay, so let's look at A first. If you could play a perfect Nash equilibrium in a heads-up game, your profit would come from the degree to which your opponent failed to mimic or mirror your strategy. That's absolutely correct. If you're playing perfect at a perfect Nash equilibrium, you're at Nash. That's your location in the game space geometry of no limit hold'em, if you will. And your opponent is at a distance of, say, 5 Nava units. I'll work on it. Navanometers, navanometers. I don't know. I was trying to think of a unit of measure that we could call units of game space at equilibrium. So if your opponent is X distance away from equilibrium, and you're playing exactly at equilibrium, that X distance is going to be equal to your edge in the game. So your edge in the game is going to be obviously what leads to your profit. So yeah, the more your opponent fails to mimic your strategy, the more money he loses in a very direct correlated way. B, flat calling ace-ace pre-flop is a way to uncap your calling range. Well, what does it mean to uncap a range? It means that you can have the nuts, right? If your range is not capped, if your range is uncapped, it means exactly that you can have the nuts in your range. Pre-flop, pocket aces are the nuts. So flat calling aces pre-flop is a way to uncap your calling range. So if you're in some spot where you don't want to have a capped flat calling range, the way to do that is to occasionally flat call with pocket aces, or sometimes just always call with pocket aces. An example might be if you're playing against a very, very aggressive and good skilled player, and you're very, very deep, and he's playing the button, and you're playing out of the big blind, you may not want to 3-bet like a linear range. In fact, you might not want to 3-bet anything at all. And if you do decide to 3-bet some hands, it's probably going to be a pretty good idea to use a mixed strategy to avoid uncapping your flat calling range. If you're 3-betting like a linear range from the big blind, 500 big blinds deep against the button, then every time you flat call, your opponent's going to know that your range is weak, and he's going to be able to move you off of your hands very often by the river. And once you 3-bet, your hand your hand is going to be 2 face up to take your hand out of position against an opponent who's going to be playing a lot of hands in position, and who is very skillful and skilled enough to leverage the fact that he's got good information about what kind of hands you could or could not have. Kind of got off on a bit of a tangent there, but B is actually a true statement, so it is not the answer. C, larger bets allow you to work more bluffs into a polarized range. That's also a true statement, but maybe needs a little clarification. You cannot just use a bigger bet size in any spot and say, well, I'm just going to bet bigger in this spot so I can work more bluffs into my range, and then just decide to bluff more of your air because you have a larger bet size. Like, you can't get to the river with a shit hand and just think like, well, I'm just going to make a really big bet, that way I can work more bluff into my range, and I won't have to worry about whether this hand fits into that range or not. That's not the way this works. The way it works is you're going to have a range that wants to bet for value. First and foremost, that's the first thing. Once you have this value betting range, you have to see what kind of value targets it has. Then once you've established, so like the more value targets, the more hands that can call you and lose, the more valuable your value betting range is, and the more valuable your betting range is, the more like the bigger you can bet, and the more bluffs that you can work in. So if you like end up in a river spot with 12 value combos that are nutted value, like you're going to deal with all kinds of really, really strong hands, then you probably would benefit from making a very large, possibly all-in bet, just to be able to pull in the maximum number of large bets. Of bluffs. But that depends on and requires you to have a sufficiently large number of very strong hands. Like your value betting range has to be nutted before you can just start pulling in a bunch of bluffs. So the two things kind of work each other out. It's kind of like a chicken and egg, which came first, the chicken or the egg scenario. Using a larger bet size allows you to work more bluffs in, and working more bluffs in requires you to use a larger bet size. D, the advantage to having the initiative going to the flop is roughly equal to or on par with a positional edge is just complete nonsense. First of all, there's no way to quantify that positional edge or how much it's worth. At least I don't think there is. And there wouldn't be any way to quantify the difference between two edges, I don't think. But really, there's no such thing as initiative, right? So that's kind of a trick question. Well, it is a trick question. There is no advantage to having initiative. There's no magical principle called initiative that, if you were the pre-flop raiser, somehow gives you and only you the ability to make profitable bets on the flop. Now, there is such a thing as having an uncapped range. We've already touched on that a little bit. And if you were the last raiser pre-flop, so you were the open raiser and you didn't get 3-bet, or somebody opened and you 3-bet and didn't get 4-bet, if you were the last player to put a raise in pre-flop, then it's likely that you have an uncapped range, right? Like, it at least appears that your range is uncapped, because you can still have aces, you can still have kings and ace-king, because you were the last player to raise pre-flop, and that can give you incentive to bet a lot of flops, especially when being the last street's aggressor gives you not only an uncapped range or a less capped range, but it also gives you a less bound range. Bound means the floor. Like, if you 3-bet pre-flop, you could be bluffing. If you flat call pre-flop, or if you open raise and then call a 3-bet pre-flop, you're not bluffing. So your range is bound. Your hands can only be so bad. The worst hand in your range is going to just be whatever the worst hand is that you would call a 3-bet with in that situation. But the 3-better can have hands that are nowhere near strong enough to call a 3-bet out of position, and he can have pocket aces. So he can have the nuts, he can have bluffs. So because he's going to have a more polarized range, he's going to have more incentive to bet more flops. That's true most of the time. But it isn't just having initiative, it's just the way that your range is. If you were the pre-flop raiser, let's say that one player opened from the cutoff seat and you made a 3-bet from the big blind. Okay, now if the flop comes out 8, 9, 10, two-tone, if you 3-bet and got called, you probably are not going to want to see-bet that flop. That's probably going to be more in the open raiser's range, because he raised and then called, and these are middling hand. So what's happening is I'm getting cotton mouth, and it's causing a little bit of an issue. An issue, not initiative. So the advantage to having initiative isn't a real thing. Okay. If the flop comes out in a way that favors the pre-flop caller's range, then you shouldn't just mindlessly be stabbing C-bets out there as the pre-flop raiser. It's just the fact that the pre-flop raiser will usually have more reason to bet more flops than pre-flop caller because of the pre-flop caller having a more narrowly defined, capped and bound kind of merged range, where the pre-flop raiser will have usually more of a polarized, less defined, more bluffs, more nutted value type stuff than the caller. Okay, question number 29. This is the bonus section. Phil Hellmuth Jr. is good at no limit hold'em. And question 30. Which of the following is not a true statement? A. Navinat on no limit hold'em is among the best ways to improve your no limit hold'em game online for free. B. Navinat charging only $20 an hour for coaching is absurd value, especially when the first session is free. What? C. Jonathan Little's book on no limit hold'em poker, books on no limit hold'em poker are much better. Damn it. I should have stopped at like slide 13 or something. There was no slide 13. 26.
I don't know if that is.